Hi, welcome to SSAC16. My name is Ryan McPherson. I'm a first-year student here at MIT Sloan. I have the distinct pleasure of introducing the Moneyball panel this morning, which has obviously a great lineup of distinguished guests here. First and foremost, we have Michael Lewis.
You gonna come up?
Come on up. Best-selling author and the namesake for today's panel. We have Bill James, legendary writer and statistician, and Paul DiPodosta, Chief Strategy Officer of the Cleveland Browns. Today's Moneyball panel will be moderated by Jackie McMullen, ESPN sports writer.
Thank you.
Lastly, this panel will last 45 minutes, at which point we'll open it up for Q&A. We ask that if you have questions, to submit them via Twitter. Use the hashtag MoneyballReunion, and the ones that get the most mentions will be pushed up to the front, and we'll push it over to Jackie.
So be nice to me, or I won't do your question.
Right. With that, thank you. Jackie, take it away.
All right. Good morning, everybody. This is a really exciting panel. I reread Moneyball just to make sure it held up, and guess what? I was the only one, it turns out. We were backstage. I was asking Michael, remember when you said this? He said, no, I don't.
That's true.
That is true.
Yeah.
It is. But I do want to start with you, Michael. We talked a little bit backstage about how this book came to be. And I think it would be fun to share with the audience the fact that you had to actually call an editor at some point and say, I have this great book about baseball.
When I started in on this, I'd never written a word about sports. So it was completely implausible to my publisher that I would write a book about. I mean, I didn't want to even bring it up. But I'd been kind of nosing around Paul's office for 2 or 3 months. It became clear. What interested me in the first place was, I don't think I've ever told you this. I started watching the Oakland A's a few years before you showed up, because thinking of doing a story, because I noticed that the left fielder was being paid like $4 million and the right fielder was being paid $150,000, and it was the salaries were exploding, and I wondered how pissed off the right fielder was when the left fielder dropped a fly ball. I thought maybe there would be a story about like class warfare inside of a baseball team. And so I just started watching it that way, looking at the money on the field. And it morphed into this, how are they winning without any money? And I thought I was going to write a magazine piece. Paul will tell the story that I came in and lied and said I was going to write a magazine piece when I had a book up my sleeve all along. In fact, I thought I was going to write a magazine piece, and I didn't know quite what it was about, except I wanted to explain this. Like, what were they doing that were enabling them to get so much more out of their money than everybody else? And I spent, it was probably a good part, 6-8 weeks with them before I realized this was not a magazine piece, it was a book. And there were several things that triggered that, and we can get into that if you want to do that. But I remember I had this epiphany one night because I wrote this email to my editor, who's been the editor of all my books. And I said, I've got bad news and bad news. The bad news is I want to write my next book about baseball. And the worst news is that I want to write it, I think it's 2 books. And I want to write, the first book is going to be called Moneyball. And I only want to write that so I can write the second book, which is a sequel, which is about the kids they've just drafted. So it must have been right after that draft, the 2002 draft. Okay. And I never wrote the sequel, but Moneyball got written. And that was how it started.
So, Jackie, there are 2 sides to every story.
Yes,
no,
there is.
There's one side, and when you're done with your side, I'll explain what actually happened.
You just had your turn.
All right, go ahead.
Turn.
No, it's actually, it's quite true. I mean, Michael, you first came in spring training in 2002, and he was writing an article for the New York Times Magazine. And it wasn't unusual to have national writers around, that time of year in spring training. What was unusual was that it was you, as opposed to a typical sports writer. And then, you were around a few days in spring training and through some different homestands, I think in April and May. And I remember at one point you even asking, you said, I have a handful of these different stories. I'm trying to figure out how to tie them together. And I forget who mentioned it, but someone had said, we have 7 picks in the top 40 or whatever it was in this year's draft. And you said, great, do you mind if I sit in the draft room? And Billy said, no, it's fine as long as you just sit in the back and don't say anything. And then that day in the draft room, at least in my 20 years in baseball, it was the most emotionally charged draft room I'd ever been a part of. And at the end of the day, I was in the back of the room, I was getting some food, and you were back there too, and I said, just very innocently, so like, hey, what do you think? And you looked at me right away and you said, this is too rich, this isn't an article, this is a book.
Huh.
And I literally turned around, I walked straight to Billy and I said, it's time to clam up, he's writing a book. So no, I think it is. It's pretty accurate as to how it happened.
And we'll get to that 2002 draft in a minute, because to me that was probably the most riveting part of the book. But I discovered something this morning when I arrived, and that is that, Paul, I think you would acknowledge that Bill James is one of the greatest influences in your professional life. I don't want to put words into your mouth.
Yeah, I mean, certainly his work was,
Right.
was extraordinary, yeah.
They just met for the first time today. I think that's amazing. Bill?
That's the same thing they tell me when I go into a draft room. You can be here, but just sit in the corner. But I can't do it. I can't. I have to say something, so and they tell me to get out.
So Bill James got me through this book, because one of the problems with writing a book about a season with the Oakland A's is you have to watch all these blasted baseball games, and it gets so tedious. It's unbelievably tedious. And I would take the abstracts with me, a sack of them. I can remember in every press box, people would be watching the game, and I'd be reading the abstracts. And he kept, you know, the intellectual like substructure to the book. It's all him. It all comes out of his stuff. And he showed me just how exciting on the page baseball could be made. So he ends up being him. And I made the pilgrimage to Lawrence. I don't know what you thought I was doing, but you remember we had dinner and
Yeah. Oh yeah. It was fun. You were looking for a gift for your wife, and we went to Hobbs.
that's right.
I remember it all.
Well, one of the things that I think because Moneyball was written quite a long time ago now, that we've forgotten, is this really was a seminal moment for the everyman as to what was going on in baseball. Bill, you had been doing it for quite a long time. Paul, you had been doing it for quite a long time. But for the lay people, I think when you read Moneyball, you're like, wow. So I want to get to Bill a little bit about how you devised some of these formulas. Gosh, there's so many, I don't even know where to start. But one of the things I thought was interesting was errors. It was impossible to define an errors before, and you created this range factor, and I think it was runs created, hits plus walks times total bases. So how do you formulate these ideas in your head to apply them to the game of baseball, which is so complicated?
Well, the point I would make is that what I was doing was totally different than what Paul was doing or what other people did with the stuff that I had done. What I was doing was just trying to get from a question to an answer. And in order to get from a question to an answer, we had to create a sort of structured way of looking at the problem. It turned out as a sort of aside that the structured ways of looking at the problem were very useful to people who were in the game, but I didn't have any understanding of that at the time. That was just an accident.
Really?
And the example of that always sticks with me is that I used to do these projections of what players would hit the next year, just totally for the hell of it. I mean, I know it's not science, doesn't mean anything, but I enjoy doing it, so I'm going to do it. And for a long time, I wouldn't publish them, and John DeWan, who I worked with at that time, still do, insisted that we should publish these things, and I said, we can't publish them, that doesn't mean anything, it's just something I make up out of the air. And we published them, and within a year, 2 or 3 other people were also publishing their projections and claiming that their projections were more accurate than our projections, which I don't doubt that they were. And now I think every team, every team now, I assume, makes some sort of projections of what their players are going to do next year. And when you look at it, you think, well, of course they do. I mean, why would they? How could you plan what you're going to do next year unless you make some sort of projections of what you can expect from each player? But at the time, I thought, I'm just doing this. I didn't even publish it. I mean, I just did the projections for my own benefit because I didn't think about how it would later be used by baseball professionals. And that's true of almost everything I did, that I never really thought about what use this would be to baseball professionals. I was just doing it.
But wasn't it a little frustrating after a while? I mean, I think your first baseball abstract was in 1977, is that
Yes.
thereabouts? And then people are, people like Billy Beane, people like Paul, and I guess we'll throw Michael in there too, since he was part of the crew. They're using your data, they're studying it, they're applying it, and yet you had all these really cult-like followers, but none of them were general managers, none of them were hiring you, none of them were coming after you. Was that frustrating to you at all?
Well,
I mean, there was a real resistance initially, yes?
there was there's tremendous resistance. There still is.
Yes.
But it wasn't all their fault, actually. I mean, a lot of times I was kind of I was sort of rude to people, to be honest.
Don't apologize. Don't apologize now. That's why it was so
late?
great. It's too late. You can't backtrack and become one of them.
It's probably true.
It is, and the thing about these things that was so great. I mean, the specific arguments were fabulous, but it was so refreshing to pick up something about baseball. Most of what you read or heard about baseball was coming out of the mouths of someone who already knew.
That's interesting.
The spirit was it was such a knowing. I mean, a lot of industries are this way, but baseball especially. People who talk about baseball know about baseball, and what was coming out of these very learned treatises was underneath it was, I don't know. We don't know. It was like the things we can still learn. I can remember him saying to me when I went to go visit him to work on the book. He had a painting of a baseball diamond, small painting in his office. I think it was a painting, and I asked him. I said, how much at this point? So this is 2002. Do you think is known about the game compared to what will be discovered about the game? And he pointed to the painting. He said, you know what that is? That's a field of ignorance. And I thought that was a wonderful phrase, but what wonderful attitude. It's sort of like approaching this thing we all know and define ourselves by how well we know it in a spirit of inquiry. That was what was so great, and that it just yielded these riches, just to start with. I don't know.
But that's where the resistance comes from. I mean, Paul, so many of the scenes in the book have you sitting on your laptop in these meetings with these grizzled old scouts that have their way of evaluating players. And here you come, and you and Billy together, and you're telling them, no, we're not going to draft the high school phenom because our data shows us that a college player is a better choice, and all these numbers. So what was it like for you to be in that room with these scouts who have made it their life's work to pick this player over this player, and then you're saying, well, but we're going to draft Jeremy Brown?
Right, well, I will say all the scouts had laptops too.
Good.
So it wasn't just me. No, look, I think, even today, when we go down to Venezuela and we're scouting 15-year-old kids, literally 15 years old, right? We're deciding whether or not we're going to sign them, how much we're going to pay them, hundreds of thousands, maybe even into the millions of dollars. We're making what amounts to an explicit prediction, right, of how that player is going to perform. Not how he's going to perform next summer, but how he's going to perform 10 or 12 years later,
right,
when he's in his mid to late 20s and a fundamentally different human being than he is at that moment.
Hopefully.
And not how he's going to perform in Maracaibo, Venezuela, but how he's going to perform, at least for me in the last 5 years, in New York City, right, in front of 40,000 fans and against the greatest competition in the world. Competition that at 15 years old, he can't even fathom, right? Inexact science,
yes.
To say the least. And I think what we finally admitted to ourselves, and this really came from Billy, was that, geez, we're not very good at this, like at all. And Billy used to tell our scouts all the time, he said, guys, I was a first-round draft pick. I was a minor league player, major league player, won a World Series as a major league player, been an advanced scout, an assistant GM, a GM. I've been in the game for over 20 years. I've seen it from all these different angles, and yet I can't walk into a high school game and point to some kid and say, he's going to be a star. I can't do it. So if I can't do it, given my set of experiences, then I don't think any of us can do it, at least not very well. So we have to come up with a different way. And I had sort of a very similar experience. When I first started working with the Cleveland Indians before I got to the A's, after my internship there, I was named the advanced scout for the major league team. So in spring training, I wrote a couple of mock reports to try to get ready for the regular season. And as I was trying to write my first one, I thought, good Lord, I'm wholly unqualified to do this job. Like, I'm sitting in the scout section thinking, like, I can't see what these other guys see. I don't have the experience to do this. And in a panicked moment, I thought, how am I going to write these reports? And yet, I had been charting all these pitches, and I had all this data and started pouring through it. And I felt like, well, I can at least write down that this guy's 1 for 21 on sliders down and away. You know, and that's not my opinion, it's just what happens. And being, I think I was 23 years old or something at the time, and dealing with Mike Hargrove and Charlie Manuel and some of those guys, I thought, you know, I'm probably much better off trying to be a court stenographer as opposed to, you know, an editorialist here, you know, and just need to let them know what happened. And that's really, at least for me, that's how I sort of got started in the data. So it was even before I went to Oakland.
So Michael, in the book you wrote that Billy Beane was a, quote, reformed alcoholic. And I think what you meant by that was that, and I find him so fascinating because I've covered a lot of coaches and GMs, many of whom were ex-players, and they so often are looking for themselves. They're looking for who they were. And Billy Beane appears to me to have been the antithesis of that. He went out and wanted to find someone who was nothing like him. He was impatient at the plate. He never felt comfortable in the box, all these things. How fascinating was the attraction of this book in part because you have this sort of tortured soul in Billy Beane a little bit?
Yeah, that really helped. If he had been less tortured, it would have been less fun to write. But getting him to admit he's tortured is hard. You don't want.
It came through.
But he doesn't. He really does. He's not forthcoming. The best time to talk to Billy and get the tortured Billy out of him was I found a couple times I went with him to minor league games where we drove, and coming back in the dark automobile was when he would just talk. And
it's like your kids,
in a way,
right?
it was pitch black. You couldn't see. And all my notes, I get home, I'd be scribbling there in the seat next to him. I couldn't read any of it when I got back home. But that's when he would talk about how frustrating it was to be identified by these baseball experts as a future baseball star and kind of have his life be distorted by their judgments and believing it, and then having the frustration of it not panning out. So it is true, what you said, I think it's true, what you just said, that the way people look for some reflection of themselves. I can remember the scouts actually, the A scouts at the time said, you know, when you go and look at college teams, all the players look like the coach. Like if the coach was a stumpy second baseman, he's got all these stumpy second basemen.
Right.
And they notice that pattern. But with Billy, I think I might have partly been referring to is sort of like what he had to learn to do is not trust his intuitive judgment. It's like to defer to evidence and data. And that's the hard part. And even in the story, there are moments where Billy just blows things up on a hunch and kind of gives in to the other side. And I think it's just really hard when you it's very hard to acknowledge that you don't know what you think you know. And I think he fought that a bit. But once, by the time I came along, Paul had been there a few years. And by the way, Paul did it all. It's kind of good that Billy didn't show up because you know, Paul deserves all the credit.
We can finally admit that.
Yeah, we can. You know, with Billy, he totally unnecessary, but except for literary purposes. But they were already so far down the road that Billy had got the religion that he wasn't going to make any decision unless there was data to back it up. So I don't know if I just answered your question or I just talked for 2 minutes.
I like when you talk. Go ahead, Bill. You can talk now.
Paul said something that was very interesting that is exactly where I was when I started writing about baseball and still am to a certain extent. And he said that he talked about being overpowered by the sense of not understanding this stuff. I admire writers, and I would include Michael in that. I admire writers who have the self-confidence to say, you know, that I believe this, I think this, And I fault academic writers because very often academics won't tell you anything they think unless they can footnote it somehow. I admire writers who have the self-confidence to do that, but I was never one of them. I always felt every sentence I've ever written in my life that unless I could prove this was true, I couldn't say it. And I think that's what Paul was talking about when he's a 23-year-old in a room with a bunch of veteran scouts, that unless I can reference this, unless I can prove it's true, I can't say it.
So you're watching the 2002 Oakland Athletics unfold here, Bill. They're using a lot of your sabermetrics. What are you thinking? What are you thinking as you're watching that season? And maybe when you're even watching that 2002 draft, which I do want to get to in just a second. What are you thinking?
Well, like everybody, I'm always looking for reflections of myself everywhere. So I would sort of imagine, you know, that's the way I said they should do that. But I never really knew what was happening anywhere. And, you know.
I mean, were you guys having any conversations at that time, Paul, or were you talking with Billy, or was it just the influence of his writing and his work?
You know, I'm not sure where it came from in terms of Billy. I can tell you, again, as I mentioned the Indian story, my work really came out of desperation, right? I have to figure out a way to contribute, you know, yeah, and be relevant, actually do my job. But I don't know. I know there was already this culture in Oakland that had been created really by Sandy Alderson, you know,
right,
that Billy grew up into. And so I don't know everything behind how that really got started, but you know, Cleveland was a pretty progressive place at the time too, and we had a bunch of sort of really young guys in the office.
Was it Neil Huntington?
Yeah, actually, when I first got to Cleveland, John Hart was the general manager, Dan O'Dowd was the assistant GM, Mark Shapiro was the farm director.
Yep.
Josh Burns was the assistant in baseball ops, and then I was the intern. And then 2 years later, Neil Huntington joined us as an assistant in player development. So, and Ross Adkins was a player in our minor leagues. So it was a really interesting place to be. I had no idea what I had walked into. I was incredibly fortunate.
That's great. So one of the things that came through in the book too was the real backlash with, again, these scouts. Most of them were ex-players or had played. And you know, Finey, one of the characters in the book, he's going through film, and I forget which scout it was saying, "You never played, did you, Finey? You never played. I want to hear you say you never played," because he was, you know. So how hard was that to combat when you have people that are entrenched in a sport that they've grown up with, that they've loved, that they've played? We run into this in all the sports, right? If you didn't play, you didn't know, which I think is utter nonsense, you know?
Sure. I think the seminal moment for us, I think at least in terms of amateur players, came in a draft before the 2002 draft. And it actually centered around, I think this was in the book, centered around Kevin Youkilis.
Right.
Okay,
the Greek god of walks.
Right. So what actually transpired was that we were talking about this guy, Kevin Youkilis, and our reports actually, the summary in our reports were quite favorable of him, saying this is an Oakland A's kind of player, doesn't look the part, but he really grinds out at bats, et cetera, et cetera. But then the grades on him were very low, low enough to put him sort of further down in the draft. But again, as we kept going through these reports saying, geez, this is our kind of guy. He hits all of our marks in terms of his performance metrics, and yet we like him somewhere after the 10th round. And so he became this real hot point of debate, not because any of us thought he was going to be a multi-time Silver Slugger for the Boston Red Sox or anything like that. Right.
Yeah.
We just thought he was misplaced on our board based on the conversation that had taken place. And finally, he created this dialogue about just the process of drafting players. You know, and how do we put this board together? Why are we grading them this way? What's important to us? What isn't? So that's really, I think, that discussion. And then everyone kept telling me, we're going to get him. We're going to get him. And I was saying, guys, I've never even seen the player. I just think that there's sort of something fundamentally wrong here. And then the draft rolled around. You know, it was pretty rapid fire in those days. And over the speakerphone, you hear, you know, Boston Red Sox select Kevin Youkilis. And it was probably, what was it, the 7th round or 8th round? and you could hear a pin drop in our room, and I could feel everybody just staring at me. And finally I said, guys, I've never even seen him, you know? And, but it really was, that was a big moment for us, because I think after that draft was over, Billy and I spent a lot of time talking about how can we do this differently.
Yeah, let's not this guy get away the next time.
Right.
Okay, so that's a good time to bring us to the 2002 draft, which I thought was one of the most riveting parts of the book because of the tension in the room. And Nick Swisher was the one everybody knew, not just you guys. I think you had Operation Shutdown, you called it, I think.
Billy told everybody to pretend he wasn't interested in Swisher, because he already had a sense that other organizations were watching what he was doing. And why he had that sense, I don't know. But he was told not to go look at Swisher. You remember that? Yeah.
But then by not looking at him, they called him and said, you must be interested in Swisher because you haven't come to look at him.
Right.
So that didn't work out so well.
Yeah.
But so you've got 7 picks in the 2002 draft. Just if you can, take me through a little bit. You're preparing, you're bored, and you're using a lot of the things that Bill James had been writing about for years, that walks do matter, getting on-base percentage does matter. So just share, if you can, with the crowd a little bit about, I just thought it was a pretty major shift for your team, that draft in particular.
Well, again, I think going back before that draft, probably after all the Youkilis incident happened, I remember one night during a game, Billy and I were in the weight room and we were talking about it, and Billy finally, well, just to put it in perspective, the baseball round is, back then the baseball draft was 50 rounds. And the average draft produced 1 everyday major league player. So
Is that
1 out
right?
of 50.
One?
So there'd be, maybe 3, 4, 5 other guys who actually appeared in the major leagues, but on average there'd be 1 everyday player from each draft.
Wow, that is stunning.
So we were there during the game, we were talking about it, and Billy said, could you imagine what would happen if we just got 2? Just 2.
Right.
And we did it 2, 3, 4 years in a row? I mean, it would fundamentally change our franchise. So we started talking about, what can we put in place just to stack the odds in our favor of maybe just getting 2, right? So that was really the backdrop leading up to the 2002 draft, and we tried to put in and implement a lot of these processes just to stack the odds in our favor. We still knew we were going to be wrong most of the time. And even if we were wrong, in this case, 48 out of 50 or 47 out of 50, we'd be perfectly
You're
happy.
ahead of the curve,
yeah,
sure.
as long as it wasn't 49 out of 50. And so that was really the backdrop. So as we were putting the board together, the other thing was we didn't have enough money to make 7 legitimate picks in the top 40. We couldn't pay them all. So that was part of it too, was trying to figure out, how to maximize these picks with the money we had available to us, which is where guys like Jeremy Brown or Steve Stanley came into the equation, where we thought they were guys we wanted somewhere in the draft, but to make our draft work from a financial standpoint, we had to put them somewhere else. But that's really where it all started, was really trying to put together a strategic way of stacking the odds in our favor.
So for those of you who don't remember, Jeremy Brown was a catcher from Alabama. He was a senior, and I think I've got it here. The only player at that time in the SEC history who had 300 hits and 200 walks. So again, playing to on-base percentage. And I have your amateur. You're talking about foot speed, fielding, raw power. Those were things that you thought were overvalued, and none of those applied necessarily to Jeremy Brown. But Michael, so you're in the room. And you're hearing, you heard about Jeremy Brown in advance, right? Because you're
Yeah, no, I've been sitting through the meetings.
Right.
They were arguing about, the scout had said that when he walked, he was so fat his thighs rubbed together and he was going to light his jeans on fire. And that was all that stuff going on. And by then I was alive to this theme, because actually it was like one of the moments leading up to the draft where I had an epiphany about like how rich this story was were the bodies on the Oakland A's. I mean, I've told Paul this, that when I was first getting into the story, I went to go talk to the players. I was curious, and in the draft too, the players on the other end of this draft, like how were they responding to being in this lab rats in this science experiment? They were being seen in a way they hadn't been seen before. And talking to the players on the actual Oakland A's, I kind of go in, I'd move down the lockers and talk to each one of them. And one day I was in the locker room after a game, and the players, it was the first time I saw the players coming out of the showers, and they were all naked, and they looked so bad. They were fat, and I mean, I remember guys had fat ankles. I thought, and a baseball uniform covers up so much. You didn't realize just how unattractive these people were. And I went over to Paul's. I don't even remember the conversation. I went over there. I said, "My God, I just saw your players naked. And if you line those naked bodies up against a wall and ask people what they did for a living, no one would guess they were professional athletes. I mean, you know, there's not a chance. You know, accountants maybe. And he said, that's funny. That's kind of one of the points. He says we've got to find people who have some defect that doesn't matter, that deceives people about their value. And sometimes what that defect is just it's just their physical appearance. So if they're ugly or fat, or he started talking about Jim Messier. He had a relief pitcher who had 2 club feet. And he said that threw people off the scent. You know, that the club feet they thought helped him throw a screwball. But that, you know, he was of slightly less interest than he should have been because people looked at the club feet and said, well, really, should he be on a baseball field? And so I had this in my head going into the draft. And all of a sudden these guys are talking about, oh, he's too fat. And Billy Beane keeps saying,
like, Oakland A's.
We're not selling. I was thinking, yeah, then he's an Oakland A. You know, that's what they're looking for, guys that are whose surface appearance is deceiving the market about their value. And I thought that was just spectacular. So watching this draft, I was watching it. That was one of the lenses I was watching it through. Is how Steve Stanley was too short. You know, these things are not always wrong. It's just that they may queer the judgment of the marketplace and give you an opportunity to get a cheap asset. And Jeremy Brown was a really big example of this because he really didn't look so good. And the great thing was when you found, I mean, the story of Jeremy Brown, it's really too bad how it turned out because basically Jeremy Brown decided he didn't want to play baseball. But if he'd wanted to play baseball, he might still be in the big leagues. I mean, he had a shot, and they weren't wrong in picking him. The narrative has been, oh, they were wrong because he didn't stick. He got to the big leagues, but it's a more complicated story than that. But when I was curious. My first reaction when I hear them talking about these guys is, I wonder what the hell Jeremy Brown thinks of this. And when they called him after they drafted him, I got in touch with him and went down and saw him. And I said, you know, Jeremy, what did you think when the scout from the Oakland A's called you and said, we're going to make you a first-round draft choice? He goes, Mr. Lewis, he said, I thought it was a crank call. I mean, I was a crank. I just thought, no, this is not true. He hung up. He thought I was a fraternity brother playing a joke on him.
Sure. Because
no one had ever seen this value in him. And I thought, to me, that was the heart and soul of this whole story, was the value they were seeing in people that people had not been appreciated by others. So the story of Scott Hatteberg and Chad Bradford,
all those guys.
That's what got my juices flowing when I got out of bed. And so this draft was the epitome of it. These kids, they didn't quite know who they were, and they're being told, you know, we think we see something in you. Right? It's a lovely story.
Well, I thought the interesting part, too, was it was very clever of the A's, of your organization, because you called Jeremy Brown in advance and said, we may draft you, and we may draft you in the first round, but we don't want to pay you first-round money. So if we draft you, you have to agree ahead of time to take this salary because we can't afford to pay 7 first-round draft picks. Our budget is such we can't afford that. So that, to me, is a very interesting subplot to this.
Yeah.
How do those conversations go?
You know, usually, well, after we got past the idea that maybe we were crank calling these guys, I think they actually went fine. You know, it's interesting. A lot of people have asked me through the years, how did the players react to all this analysis that you were doing? And did they feel like lab rats or things like that? And I'd say no, you know, quite the opposite. I think for the most part, we ended up, and really what our mission was trying to find value where it wasn't readily apparent to everybody else. So a lot of times when we brought these players aboard, it was the first time they were appreciated, you know, by someone. Whether it was Olmedo Saenz, who was a minor league free agent, or Scott Hatteberg, who was non-tendered,
Hatteberg in particular, right?
Or Chad Bradford, who had been up and down, you know, in AAA because he only threw 84 miles an hour or whatever it was. And we were telling them, we love what you do. We think you're incredibly skilled. We think you're really valuable. You're going to help us win a lot of games. And for the first time, I think for a lot of these guys, aside from being great in Little League or in college or something like that, felt really good about themselves. So we had a clubhouse full of those kind of guys, and I think it actually added to our culture.
Of course, the danger is a guy like Jeremy Brown or anyone else that you pick in the first round and have this conversation with. Scott Boras is on the phone with them the next day after they're drafted, and you do worry about it all blowing up, right?
Yeah, I mean, fortunately, none of that ever happened to us.
I mean, that's amazing that it didn't.
Yeah.
You're very fortunate in that. So, Bill, I want to ask you, someone like Scott Hatteberg, who was a catcher, that's what he was. He was a catcher by trade. He blew out his elbow, and he has trouble finding a team. And then the Oakland A's call him up and say, yes, we really are interested. We want you, but we want you to play first base. So tell me why that's a good idea from your perspective.
I thought the guy who played him in the movie was really great. Very often we judge everybody around us by the things they can't do, and it's another thinking inversion to realize that you have to look at people and ask what can he do and find the value in what can he do. But that's still true in a draft room today. If you sit through a draft room today, there's a lot of talk about what people can't do, and very often it's not relevant. I think the case of Scott, I think Hatteberg, what was relevant was what he could do. I was just trying to remember, I think this was yesterday or 2 days ago, I was sitting with a couple of the scouts, and we were talking about guys who were great in spring training, and I was trying to remember Almada Sain's name, because I don't know if you remember this, but I swear he hit 500 in spring training every year. And I remember being down there in Arizona and seeing you. I believe in 2002, I think he was hitting 500 in spring training. I was trying to remember those guys. I couldn't come up with his name.
I mean, just to build on Bill's point, it's so true, and I think it happens everywhere. It's sort of natural. And when we're in Major League spring training and we're in cut meetings, having to send players back down, when someone's going to make our team, all we do is talk about what they can do. And when someone's not going to make our team, all we do is talk about what they can't do. And we make it sound like these guys shouldn't have made their high school team. I mean, it's unbelievable. And it's not, a conscious decision by anyone. And we all fall into the trap. I mean, it's scouts, coaches, front office. We sort of all do it. But it really is revealing when we take a singular attribute that two players share, but we describe it very differently depending on the fate of the player, right? So, for instance, someone's not going to make our team, and he happens to, wiggle his bat around a lot right before the pitch comes. Someone in the room will say, you know what, that's way too much pre-pitch movement. That'll never play in the major league. And the whole room sort of goes, yeah, you're right.
So that becomes the hook.
Yeah, you're right. He needs to go back down AAA, work that out. And then 15 minutes later, we'll be talking about someone else who's going to make our team, who does virtually the exact same thing with his bat. And if someone's brave enough in the room, they'll say, well, what about that pre-pitch movement? And the same guy will say, are you kidding me? He likes to stir it up and let it eat. I don't even know what that means. But it doesn't stop any of us in the room from saying, hey, man, you better believe it.
Right.
Boy, he gets after it. He's going to help us win a lot of games. So we really do. I think we see what we want to see, we describe it the way we want to describe it. And in places like draft rooms, or in cut meetings, it comes out every time. It's just human nature.
I thought you described Scott Hatteberg's spring training at first base beautifully in the book. Ron Washington was your fielding coach, who of course went on to be the manager of the Red Sox, and he was abysmal. He's abysmal. So all the naysayers are saying, "You're going to put this guy at first base? He can't dig the ball out of the." Could you just remember? Do you remember
What's so
watching?
charming about Scott Hatteberg is so most professional athletes, in my experience, share one trait. They're all overconfident.
Yeah,
they would not be where they wouldn't be where they were if they weren't totally overconfident.
Right.
They're just crazy overconfident. It's why they blow their money, right? Why they can't hold on to it, because they think they think they can do the same thing. They believe their judgments everywhere. One of the charming things about Scott Hatteberg, and actually Chad Bradford too, but Scott Hatteberg in particular, was he actually wasn't overconfident. He was filled with self-doubt. And he was a really intelligent person, like not a professional athlete intelligent. And I don't mean that the way that sounded.
Too late.
But,
Too late. Yeah. Too late.
Although I will tell you that I can remember Billy Beane once turning to me and saying, "You do realize you can't be too stupid to play baseball." And he said this, he said, you can be too stupid to play football, you can be too stupid to play basketball. Those games involve some complexity. There's no such thing as too stupid to play baseball. But so the filter in baseball is a little different actually than the other sports. Hatteberg, because of this, like he's almost like he's got an intellectual dimension to him. He was filled with self-doubt about playing first base. He said, I can't, how am I going to do that? He had what I loved about, the best part of the story is before he gets to spring training, he has his wife, who's about that high, out on a tennis court, hitting him grounders with his like 6-year-old to toss the balls to after he's going out over and over and over in the winter outside of Seattle, Washington, because he's so panicked about this. And it turns out he ended up okay, right? I don't know. He wasn't terrible anyway.
He did well.
Yeah.
He did well. I mean, I remember when we first called him, because he was non-tendered, and then literally a minute later, we were on the phone with his agent saying, we really want to sign Scott, and we think we want to play him at first base. And we started talking about Teddy Simmons and all these other guys who had made the transition at some point in their career from catcher to first
Kelly
base.
Ramirez.
But trying to sell him on the, idea. But
and the other thing is, I'm now talking out of my socks, and they will correct me. But my sense is that when they get to that level, when they're in the big leagues, or they're in the NBA, or they're in the NFL. There's the same knowingness you have in the executive ranks. You have a need to be kind of infallible and invulnerable as a player. That you can't admit you need to learn new things. You're there because you're a big leaguer.
Right.
And so I suspect it makes the relationship between the coach and the player a little more fraught than it would have been in high school.
Right.
And one of the beautiful things about Ron Washington is he has the personality to break through that ice and actually teach people things who think they don't have anything to learn, or think they at least have to pretend like they have nothing to learn. Now, Hatteberg knew he had something to learn, so he was a willing recipient of the wisdom, but it was a joy watching Ron Washington actually, it took me back to my, being on the playground, kid years, teach Scott Hatteberg how to do something, and Scott Hatteberg wanting to learn it at that level. It's such you don't think of it really happening, and it's kind of not supposed to happen, but it should happen, right?
Well, that's why everybody thought Ron Washington would be a great manager.
he was terrific. Yeah. He really was. I mean, he was the one who coined the phrase "picking machine."
That's right.
For Scott Hatteberg, I think
to make him feel good.
Yeah.
He'd say he's a picking machine, and it's Hatteberg kind of I feel a little better about myself.
I think we should probably explain why you were interested in Scott Hatteberg in the first place. Bill, maybe you could do that for us. Statistically, he's exactly what we've been talking about probably this entire panel.
Yeah, Hatteberg had been a catcher with the Red Sox. Well, one thing that was interesting in your account there was that somebody in your organization, it may have been you, had figured out that the Red Sox were going to non-tender him before they did, so that you were prepared to act on it 1 minute later. That's the David Ortiz has become a historic figure in baseball, but that's the story everybody misses. Somebody in our organization, I think it was Jed Hoyer, but somebody had figured out that the Twins were going to non-tender him before they did, so that the moment he was non-tendered by the Twins, we were on top of it because somebody had figured it out before. Hatteberg was a catcher who was able to get on base, and he didn't hit a lot of home runs. He didn't run much better than I do. And he wasn't a good defensive catcher, but he was able to get on base. You have to win ball games with things that people can do. You can't win any ball games with the things that people can't do. You only win games with the things they can do, and that was the thing he could do. And you guys found a way to make use of it.
I will say, I went back last summer. I was traveling somewhere and I was getting on a plane, and for some reason, I had just seen Scott, and I went back and I looked at his statistics the year before we signed him. Mm-hmm. They were pretty bad. I mean, they were pretty bad. And
even his on-base percentage was
Yeah, and I texted Billy and I said, do you remember that this is how bad it was? And we signed this guy to replace the MVP,
right,
like Jason Giambi. Like, wow. Like, we were committed, at that point for sure.
Right.
And I remember at one point being out in the parking lot with Billy as we were leaving work one day, and I think we had just signed Scott, and we were sort of giggling, but kind of nervously, like, okay. I guess we've done this, you know. Let's go. Let's see how it works.
So I have one Scott Hatteberg memory that's poignant. The scene in the movie and the scene in the book where he hits the game-winning home run for the 20th to win the game for the 20th win in the winning streak. I don't know if you remember this. I had got to the stadium that day, and you were playing the Royals, and I thought it might be useful for the book. But it was a mob scene because everybody wanted to be around the Oakland A's. I thought I'm not gonna watch this. I'll go watch it on TV. And I started driving home. And I called my wife, and she said, what are you doing? I said, I'm coming home. There are too many reporters. I'm not going to get anything. She said, you fool. This might be history in the making, and you're writing a story about this team. Turn around, go back. So I turned around on the highway. I was on 880. I turned around, went back. And then the game started. And I had my press badge, but I thought, I'll just go down into the bowels of, maybe there's hope. Maybe I won't go to the press box. I snuck down to the clubhouse. And I banged on the door. The guard wasn't there. Usually the guard was there. I banged on the door, and Billy Beane opens the door. And I said, what are you doing here? He said, I'm watching this game, basically. He never watched the games. He said, you come on in. Don't tell anybody. Come on in. And we watched the game together in the manager's office. And it unfolds like a movie scene. And Scott Hatteberg's on the bench, and he's coming through, actually. He was kind of like walking back in the back, and he's drinking cups of coffee. He had 5 or 6 cups of coffee. He was wired. He was assuming he wasn't going to play. And then all of a sudden, Hatteberg, you're in. And he runs back, and he goes out and hits the home run. And I had tears coming down my face because I knew what his place was in this story. I had tears for me. I was so happy for him. And I thought, my God, my book is made. Right. And you come running back, and you see me, and you go, you are so lucky. You remember that? You said, you are so lucky. Because you knew exactly how I was structuring this thing, and Hatteberg had become important, and all of a sudden, this magical moment had happened.
See, I was always thinking of others.
Yeah.
That's great. All right, we don't have a lot of time left, so I'm going to give you some of these questions that we have from the audience. To the panelists, what do you think of Bryce Harper's comments about baseball being tired? Can analytics help? Bill, I'll give you that one.
I had not heard that Bryce Harper had said anything, and baseball has a lot of flaws as a product, and our last commissioner really did a great job of making baseball a better commercial product, but the project is not finished, and to have a 23-year-old outfielder recognize that's probably a good thing.
What would you recommend? How would you change it?
I'd get rid of the balk rule.
All right.
You think that's a silly answer, but it's not. But the balk rule interferes with the way baseball should be played at such a profound level. When you think about it, the game constantly stops, and you ask, why does it stop? It all goes back actually to the balk rule. If a pitcher could just stand on the mound and do anything the hell he wanted, which he should be able to, then the game, you wouldn't have to take a set position. The batter wouldn't have to be ready. What the balk rule does is the same thing it would do to basketball if you made a rule that you couldn't have a fast break.
That's a great answer.
That's really interesting. I'm trying to imagine what the game. So he could.
It's his book. It's his next book. The balk rule.
So to get rid of the balk rule, what happens next? What does the pitcher start doing if he has?
The pitcher can do whatever he wants to.
But what do you imagine might happen?
You have to have some other rule to control. You can't throw the first 5 times, right? So you have to limit how many. But the balk rule has been in the game since like the 1840s, and people think that you can't play baseball without it, but in fact you can. And what I envision is a kind of live ball baseball where the ball is always live because you don't have to constantly stop the game to restart it for the next pitch, because the pitcher can do what he wants to on the mound. And if he wants to have a fake double move, all right, there's no reason you can't We don't ban fakes in anywhere else in the sports world.
Yeah.
I mean, you can't say, no, I'm sorry, he faked that shot before he took it. He can't do that. But that's what the ball rule does. So.
It would be a lot
Bill,
more fun to watch, but so would tackling the runners.
But if he can,
There's another idea.
Yeah, I mean, that's another possibility. Only the shortstop can tackle.
but what about if he can throw to first base? I guess you would absolutely have to limit how many times, because we're talking all the time in baseball about keeping the game moving, right? And you're saying that if you get rid of the ball, you're moving it, but then someone would counter, well, but now these pitchers are going to throw to first base, and that's going to take longer. And
You get one bad throw to first, and then, you know, the next time you throw to first, if you don't get him, he goes to second, basically.
oh, we have a new commissioner. Okay. Paul, this question's for you. How are you going to use your experience with analytics in baseball and bring it to the NFL now with the Cleveland Browns?
I can't tell you that.
Can I ask you something,
Just a
Paul?
little bit? A little bit?
People, because you don't believe how many people ask me what you're going to do with the Cleveland Browns, as if I would know. But what I said is, analytics means, I mean, the Browns aren't going to win anything unless they decide who their quarterback is and stop changing them every year, and decide who their coach is and stop firing them every 2 or 3 years, right? And part of what analytics is supposed to do is to take that kind of observation and carry it to the people who own the team. Is that accurate? I mean, is that part of what you're doing there, is trying to get them to realize that there has to be some sort of long-term plan here, or you're not going anywhere?
Well, hopefully they also don't fire their front office every 2 years. That's the first goal. I think that the Haslam's who own the team, they're already there, and that is why I'm there. They're already there mentally. I think, you know, the biggest thing is it's a mindset, not just stability, you know, in the office and on the field, but alignment within the organization. But it's also this mindset of a shared vision of how are we going to put this together? What are we going to believe in as an organization? What are we going to believe in terms of players? And I think a lot of that translates from what I've been doing in baseball for the last 20 years.
But here's my question. So the Denver Broncos won the Super Bowl without a quarterback, we could argue, because Peyton clearly wasn't himself. They won with a great defense. From an analytics standpoint, I think it's always been thought that you have to win. If you want to win a Super Bowl, you have to have a great quarterback. Do your analytics tell you differently?
No, I think quarterback's incredibly important. There's no real parallel
In baseball. Right.
Other than maybe your entire starting pitching staff, you know, or something like that. Because the quarterback really does control the tempo the same way a starting pitcher would. They have the ball in their hand on every play. So it really is a critical spot. That said, you know, Carolina and Denver were probably the two best defenses in football, and they were playing in the Super Bowl.
And the Patriots weren't far behind, and they were almost.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's not as though the other pieces are unimportant, but I think it's really hard to be good with a below-average quarterback. You know, do you have to have a top one in order to win? It certainly helps, but I think if you have a bottom 10 quarterback, it's almost impossible.
So, Michael, question about Moneyball. We've covered all the analytics and how fun that was and how great it was for that team. But what about just the gut? The gut for a player. A heart of a player. Can you measure a heart of a player? How much with that Oakland A's?
I remember asking Billy Beane this question. He says, if I can't measure it, I'm not going to invest in it. If you find me a way to measure it. Do I believe that such a thing exists? Sure. I mean, do I think that some players, so the way but it should express itself in their performance, right? So maybe you capture it in their statistics. I think that the sort of things that you would want to measure, gut or heart, really what you want is someone who's willing to continue to learn, right? And work at it and get better. That's something. Here's what this is going to slightly change the question, but not entirely. I thought, clearly, look, it's very important who the person is. That's ridiculous to say it doesn't matter who they are, especially when you're drafting amateur players and you're going to move them out of one context into another, and they're going to have money and they're going to be in a completely different environment and so on and so forth. The question is how you get at that. And in fact, the truth was, at least when I was marinating in this organization, no one made any effort at all to get at that. The scouts were sitting behind home plate, watching the players play, but doing very little apart from that to gather information about them. And I told Billy he should just get rid of all the scouts and hire a bunch of female journalists to go out and just dig into these players' lives. Who does drugs? What their friends are
Why
like.
do they have to be female?
Because women are better at getting this kind of information out of guys. No, in fact, I'm doing women are better at getting information out of young men than young men are, or
Well,
old men are.
But you know why that is? Because we ask whatever we want to ask.
That's probably right, and the men want to talk to them.
Well, the men are sometimes think they're like, oh, I'm too cool to ask that question. Women never think they're too cool to ask anything.
So
That's
this
why
is,
I'm moderating this
just
panel,
as an
is what I would
aside, just as an aside, for 50 years, the Israeli army has the way it's measured the character of the recruits is by having young women interview them and record what they get.
Women are in the Israeli army.
So I said, send them out and find out. You can find out all kinds of stuff about them that would be useful to know. What their family life is like. All that I'd love to know. Do they work hard at the game? All that stuff. But there was no effort being made at all to get at that information.
See, that's crazy, I think.
See, I think so too. So I'm not quite sure when people said, oh, you're ignoring guts and heart and all that, what they meant, because it seemed to me the game wasn't paying all that much attention to who these people were as people when they were making decisions, the employment decisions in the first place.
Well, your point that the statistics are intertwined with all that makes perfect sense to me. Of course, some of those things bear themselves out in statistics. If you're a patient hitter, it's because you've learned to be self-disciplined. Some of those.
He has lovely passages in his books about how you can deduce the characters of the players from the statistics early on. You have an image of a human being from the statistics.
Okay. Oops, I lost my little thing here. Give me a moment. Okay. Was there anything considered gospel in 2002 that data has since shown is inaccurate?
That's interesting. I think
That's a good question.
You know, Billy and I always tried to build systems that we thought were really flexible, so that we could adapt to the changing environment. And I know there was always a lot of talk about on-base percentage and things like that, but the reality was, again, we were value investors. At the end of the day, we were always trying to find value, whatever the market would sort of allow at that particular time. So in 2004, I had gone to the Dodgers, and leading up to the draft, Billy and I spoke a little, but only in generalities. I mean, certainly didn't share our plans with one another. The book had come out just the year before in 2003, and in 2004, in the first round, both Billy and I took high school players in Los Angeles and in Oakland. And
Which
people,
was against what you
and people
always
thought, well, wait, what's going on here? You guys just, and this is what they'd say, you just wrote this book, about, how you should take college players and all these other things. And we said, well, both of us independently had come to the same conclusion, which was after the book had been written, the college players were hugely overvalued for a short period of time because everyone said, oh, we ought to take college players, and that's what they started doing.
The influence you had, Michael Lewis. How about that?
Well, it was funny. The book, some economists did a study to see what had happened to the price of on-base percentage. And it went like that after the book. Then I don't know what's happened since. But
and then, and we did things like we signed Chris Singleton, who was a great defensive outfielder, but not necessarily a big on-base guy or anything like that. And people were flummoxed with what we were doing. But again, for us, it was always about just finding value wherever it was.
Okay, very good. I think we have time for one more. Bill, for you, Goose Gossage claims baseball is being ruined by nerds.
that's a great one to end on.
How do you respond to views like that?
I almost brought up that quote a couple days ago. Actually said nerds from Harvard, and I would like to point out, never went to Harvard.
I think someone on our panel did.
So he wasn't referring to me.
He went to Harvard.
Yes, I know.
Yeah.
I know you didn't, Bill. I'm pretty sure he did. Yeah. Go ahead.
But we were talking earlier about resistance, and that's what's changed since 2002. You used to have to pay attention to those guys. Now you can just ignore them.
I think we're going to end on that note.
All right.
You guys were excellent.
Thank you, Jackie.
Oh, I still have my mic on.